All right, welcome everyone to our first in our series of 2025 ASHE presidential webinars. My name is Jason Gilbo. I use he and him pronouns, and I'm joining you today from the land of the Chitimacha. If you need closed captioning, they are available through your Zoom menu bar. Just press the CC button. We are recording the beginning of this session. Once we go into breakout groups and have the discussion later, we'll stop the recording so things won't be recorded. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, acknowledging who you are, where you're coming from, anything you'd like to share with the group. I am here today as your ASHE staff member, so if there are any questions, any logistical issues that come up, feel free to private message me. I also want to share and remind everybody that we do have our events code of conduct for all of our ASHE events, including this one. Ideally, we won't need it, but just in case we do, I'm going to share that in the chat. If there are any conduct issues that come out, again, please feel free to reach out to me via a private message through Zoom. And with that, I will get us started. I will get things turned over to our one of our commission co-chairs, Caleb Briscoe. Caleb is co-chairing our ASHE Presidential Commission, and she'll talk a little bit about that. But thank you, Caleb, so much, as well as Veronica, who's the other co-chair, for leading and getting us kicked off today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited to have you here. Again, my name is Kayla Briscoe. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an associate professor of adult and higher education at the University of Oklahoma. And I have the pleasure of serving as one of the co-chairs for the 2025 Presidential Commission on responding to and reshaping higher education policy, alongside Dr. Veronica Jones Baldwin, who is an associate professor at the University of North Texas. The commission was established under the charge of our president, Dr. Zagalander, to address the rapid and evolving changing landscape right now around higher education policy, both at a federal and state level. And this is one of several webinar series that we hope will be and address some of the major challenges that we're experiencing within higher education in this moment. I want to drop in the chat the commission website that shares a little bit more information about the commission. I don't want to take too much of our time to be in community with each other, but I do want to thank our commission members, who some of which are here with us today: Rashonda Britton, Jorge Bernicki, Crystal Garcia, Ryan Miller, and Lauren Shook. So today we have the pleasure of talking with experts in the field around some of the constraints and restrictions to the federal and state funding. Particularly, we are thinking about some of the recent terminations to NSF, NIH, DOE, IES, some of the challenges around student loan, Pell Grant, other shifting priorities around philanthropic challenges that have been affecting many of us on college campuses in policy landscaping areas, as well as those funding agents. So we have the pleasure to welcome such an esteemed group of panelists who have expertise in all of these matters, and are going to speak to some of these issues in relation to policy, practice, and research. And so I want to welcome Ben Cecil, who is the Senior Education Policy Advisor at Third Way, Laura Espinosa, who is the Program Director of Higher Education for the Sloan Foundation, Heather McCambly, who is an Assistant Professor at the University of Pittsburgh, Amy Reid, who is a Senior Manager for Field for Dream for Penn America. And so I have the pleasure of kicking us off and letting these brilliant individuals talk about some of the issues that are impacting us all. So to start today's conversation, I just want to begin with, can some of you briefly describe the current constraints in the federal and state funding and how they're impacting your work?
So I can start, unless Lorelle, were you going to start? Okay, so The thing I'd say is that I work for Penn America, which is a not-for-profit organization that actually doesn't receive state or federal funds. Um, and so the impacts I'm seeing are not specific to my work, but they impact my work in that my team is providing support to people who are impacted by the loss of research funds, whether from federal cuts or from guidance from their institution that they should not apply for certain grants or that they should alter their research profile in order not to run afoul of state or federal concerns. I think in this moment, we're all in a bit of a panic mode. There's a lot of changes going on. We don't know from day to day what the target is going to be, whether there will be more specific cuts to an agency that will impact the resources that are available to people, whether a specific university or a class of research is going to be cut, or whether the threat is going to come from our own institutions, from the state government, or from the federal government. And I think it's hard to know how we're supposed to weather this. And telling people to just go back to World War II and, keep calm and carry on. That's a slogan, but it's a little hard to manage in this moment. And yet, I do think that what we need to do is find ways to continue doing the work that matters, whether it's our research or our support for students, or our support for colleagues, because we're all in need of support in this moment, and a lot of cuts coming on the funding side.
I'll jump in. So I feel like I'm representing, academics, so I'll try not to be too far flung in my responses. But I have two primary areas of study, and I think at least one of them brought me here today. So one of my main areas of work is studying grant making, philanthropic grant making, but also federal policy. And historically, I've really been focused on how to encourage more equitable distribution of federal and private funds in higher ed, but obviously the purpose and tenor of that work is changing rapidly under these conditions as we're seeing grants and grant making being leveraged in really specific and regressive ways. So that will largely be how I approach sharing and learning with you all in this space. And then I also study equity issues in faculty hiring. So I'm currently working through a project funded by the Sloan Foundation, actually, looking at cluster hiring as a mechanism for diversifying the professoriate. And of course, again, the tenor of that work, the people we talk to, how they're feeling about pursuing these types of initiatives in the future is changing rapidly, is scary, right? Is putting people in really precarious positions. So those are kind of the two angles I'm going to bring to the conversation today.
That might be a good cue for me. Thanks, Heather. I see several Sloan grantees on here, including Heather, which is very exciting. But yes, from a private funder perspective, if you're not familiar with the Sloan Foundation, we're a basic science research funder who also invests in sociocultural and socio-technical aspects of academic science. We give roughly $85 million per year in our grant making through various program areas, which you can learn about on our website, of course. The higher education program, which is the program that I lead, is focused on expanding access and opportunity in STEM higher education. And much like what Amy said, we're not directly affected by these cuts because we have our own endowment. The revenue that we make on that endowment through our investments is, how we make our grant making. And so in that way, very different place that I'm sitting. We don't receive any state or federal money or any donations or anything like that. That said, our work is greatly affected on the other hand, perhaps what you might think of as indirect ways, given that our grantees, who are mostly at universities, are living through these current constraints, and their projects, of course, are being affected. They're their grant money is being canceled, for example, by the National Science Foundation, which is, if you think of Sloan and you think about, maybe the federal corollary to Sloan, it would be the National Science Foundation in terms of the sciences that we are most interested in. When you think about the investments that the higher education program makes, many of those grantees are also grantees or were also grantees of the National Science Foundation STEM Education Directorate. So we are affected in that way. Our expectations have to change. We, of course, need to be much more flexible, which we are always open to being flexible. We have that luxury. But it's really about, can we see the work that we are very interested in happen or not? I mean, that's kind of the questions we're wrestling with. Our investments, I'll say it another way, are really undermined by the fact that these larger grants are being canceled, because our grants are much smaller in comparison to these large federal grants. And the projects we fund, they're leveraging those dollars. They're either using them to start something that we later support, or we might support a thing that is then supported by the federal government. That's a common role for Sloan to play. We like playing that role. And, and now we're seeing that role change. So, and that's really, perhaps to put it shortly or quickly, the way that we're being affected.
I'd add to that, much like some others here, we do not receive federal or state funds. Much of our work at Third Way, we are a national center-left public policy think tank. So we are partisan. We very much sit in the political mainstream of what's going on, not just with general politics, but also with education. And so I think kind of one thing I would say to add maybe a little bit of some four corners around what we're seeing right now is, number one, there's just a lot happening, and it's happening in a lot of different areas of government. So many of the things that we're seeing through research cuts or things with NIH, or a lot of these executive orders or issues coming through the Department of Education, are happening through executive action, through the executive branch. There's been a lot of saber rattling from the executive branch trying to really get people riled up. And I think for good reason, because this is not good policy. Executive action is generally a very poor way to go about making public policy, because it's not codified. And so those areas, I'd say I'd put in one bucket when it comes to funding. The other bucket that I would open up to is this legislative bucket. Right now, just last night, I think it was last night at 10:39 p.m. on the East Coast, the Senate Help Committee released their version of the reconciliation bill, which much of us here in DC have been spending the day going through and talking with other advocates and reporters. Looks different than the House bill, arguably a little bit better, but we also weren't starting from a really great place to begin with either. We're also in the midst of appropriations for the next fiscal year. And so that's where we're seeing a proposal for the potential maximum Pell Grant is being proposed to go down $1,700 to a level that we haven't seen since 2013, 2014. And on top of that, there's also a rescissions bill that was just moved to the House earlier this week, I believe, that would actually codify some of these budget cuts that the government efficiency people have been trying to make here over the last couple of months. And so I think for good reason, it is a very challenging environment, because we are dealing with so many different policies and orders that are all coming from different sections of the federal government right now.
Yeah. And I think all of y'all's points, especially what you have been talking about, Ben, is a great segue into our second question. Thinking about what are some of the most important and pressing policy and political dynamics driving some of these federal restrictions?
I think right now, too, unfortunately, higher ed is a bit of a cheap and easy shot, from the Trump administration. And so I think, it's something that they're going to go after. I think zooming out a little bit of how we got here, at Third Way, we focus a ton on the conversation of value and return on investment, recognizing that there's different ways to define that, and that one is not necessarily better than the other. that we can in higher education prepare students for a good career with a good job. And we can also make sure that they go to college to learn about other people and learn these different skills that are a little bit less quantifiable. But over the course of the last, call it 5 to 10 years, there's been some delineation between trust and value. And I do think that Republicans on the Hill and in the executive branch have really capitalized on that in this moment to go after higher ed in ways that it really hurts. And that's the funding mechanisms. I think that that has kind of helped set the table for where we're at today. And I do think has really been the backdrop for a lot of the policies that we're seeing come out related to student loans, Pell Grants, federal borrowing, the federal role of, or the role, excuse me, of the federal government in lending for students to go to college, for student access. And then also what the accountability conversation is looking like for higher education institutions. I think that we're there because of, kind of a culmination and unfortunate convergence of issues that has created really the perfect storm for the current administration to go after higher education in the way that they are.
I'll say private philanthropy, of course, is also waiting for perhaps changes to the endowment tax for philanthropy, which would impact certainly our grant making dollars. That's something that, of course, is being worked through right now in this budget reconciliation bill. There's also been threats by the administration to private philanthropy generally, especially philanthropy that works on what they think of as quote unquote illegal DEI. I will say that Sloan Foundation has been a leader in work around diversity in science, expanding access, promoting equity, promoting inclusion and belonging. So, we are at the forefront of that work and have been for decades. So, that's something we're certainly paying attention to. We're also paying attention to also through that reconciliation process, dramatic cuts to the NSF budget, to other federal agencies that support the work we support, like I said a moment ago, but specifically NSF, but also Energy, Department of Education, NIH, Department of Labor. We have a very robust economics research program. So, we're very concerned about that. We're very concerned about the lack of current access to federal data and the future of what federal data may look like in terms of the use of that data by the research community. Again, thinking about the researchers that we support and the data that they use. So those are a few of the other things that we're really tracking right now.
I want to pick up on something Lorelle said there, which was the phrase illegal DEI. Because I actually think that if we're looking at what's the most dangerous policy coming out, it's not so much a specific policy as a tactic of creating fear that is disempowering people. So the number of times that we have a document coming from the federal government, and this is being picked up in state capitals as well, where they label diversity, equity, and inclusion as illegal, right? That's a way of frightening everybody away from doing the work that we know matters. And it's going to frighten funders away from funding research or funding scholarships for students, researchers from doing work related to LGBTQ health, for example, and it's going to scare teachers away from teaching the topics that our students need to learn about, right? Ben talked about return on investment as sort of a theme for talking about the value of higher education. And when we reduce higher education to a very simplistic question of return, that it's just about your salary in the year after you graduate, we miss the larger value of what education brings to the table. And back to Ben's point, we need to think about the return on investment for our society when we have education and research that is encouraging people to ask questions that push back the boundaries, expanding knowledge and helping move the ball forward. So I think the disinformation and the labeling of things as illegal in order to frighten people and to make us self-censor what we're doing, I think that's the biggest challenge we face.
I agree that, Amy, that's a really important dynamic to pay attention to. It's an important dynamic to note that it's a really powerful way to create sort of de facto policy as institutions in a chilled environment over comply or engage in anticipatory compliance. They were essentially allowing policies to become de facto law by not pushing back. And I want to also kind of situate this historically, right? These types of anti-DEI strategies are not new. The phrase is, but we have seen almost this exact playbook before as a form of regressive racial backlash. So after the civil rights movement under Nixon, in the incredible kind of regressive political context of the 80s under Reagan, we've seen anti-DEI in the sense of curriculum, ethnic studies, being responsive to students of color on campus, paired with political figures actively cracking down on student protest and rolling back Pell generosity under many guises, often kind of trumped up under fears of return on investment, all paired together before, right? So specifically under Reagan is a perfect model. And it was fighting dirty to undo every single civil rights movement win that they could. So I think remembering that we've seen this playbook before is important because it reminds us that these are attempts to, both roll back Pell, which will decrease access, and to do the very most to restrict curriculum, programming, supports, other forms of aid that would tell minoritized students and faculty that we and our ideas and our ways of knowing are welcome on campus. And of course, those rollbacks hurt MSIs and others more than most. And so it's also a reminder that this is designed to demobilize politically and economically, right? So this ROI question, sure, this is an attack on socioeconomic mobility when we think about ROA, when we think about Pell, but it's also pushing back on political mobilization among minoritized communities on campuses, and especially on campuses that serve them the most. So I think that the effort at political demobilization and demobilization socioeconomically cannot and should not, be separated.
And just to say, coming back to my point, and thanks, that was such a great unpacking of the illegal DEI and so necessary to talk about, or what Amy called collusive compliance or anticipatory compliance. So there's many words, many terms, but nothing about what we're doing at the Sloan Foundation is illegal in our belief, right? And in fact, we've spent a lot of time looking at our materials. I mean, certainly over the past many years, given the attacks on these issues at the state level, and working with our grantees very closely to make sure that we're doing things that we think are absolutely legally sustainable. Spending that time, of course, is something that's necessary, but also taxing. And that just the idea that you have to spend that time figuring it all out is part of what leads to the backing away. Let's just not put the effort in, or sometimes there isn't a lot of time to go around or effort to go around or experts to go around in some of these settings. And so the pulling away is maybe even a rational choice for some people, but that's exactly what the other side really wants you to do. We've done the hard work of making sure that what we're doing is legally sustainable, and that we're supporting our grantees to make sure that they too are doing things that way.
Yeah, and I really appreciate this part of the conversation because there's been such a effort, right, to vilify diversity, equity, inclusion, to soften and weaken tenure, to attack minoritized populations and the work that we're doing nationally. And I think we feel that, right? But this is and has continuously been connected to historical acts, right? But I do think this pressure in this moment feels different for many people because of the calculated attacks on the federal level. I would also, I think you all are talking about some of this and maybe thinking about this a little bit more broader. But how are some of these shifts to federal funding priorities really affecting faculty research agendas, graduate students, and institutional missions? Because I would offer we are seeing a great shift to even how institutions respond in this moment to these calculated attacks.
I think when it comes to graduate education in particular, we're kind of being hit with a 1-2 punch because you have the decreased grant funding from all sorts of sources. And we know that that really can be a recruitment tool to have graduate students come and study. But I think, I would say maybe equally as important right now in both the House and the Senate versions of the reconciliation bill, it eliminates the Graduate Plus lending program entirely. And so that will have, I think, ramifications across the board. I think, I definitely think the time is certainly ripe for some reforms around Graduate Plus, particularly so we can kind of get a handle on all of the issues we've had with student debt. Over the past few years, over half of the debt currently in the federal loan portfolio comes from the Graduate Plus program, excuse me. But eliminating the program in its entirety will have severe ramifications for access to graduate education. And what that ultimately means is students wanting to pursue graduate school will either have to have funding that comes directly from the institution. Right now, I don't know what that looks like. When President Trump says return education to the states, I don't know that states necessarily thought they were going to have to open up their checkbooks to cover some of these gaps. But I think the more likely reality in a world without Graduate Plus is students very well may be pushed into the private lending market for graduate education, and there is significant risks to the student, higher interest rates, less consumer protections, especially in a world that we no longer have a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and other agencies that are geared towards consumer protection.
And I think it's helpful to build on that financial side to also just reflect on where we've been for the last several years, right? So faculty of color, graduate students of color for that matter, who've been recruited in recent years because of their focus on matters of equity and race are now in kind of an area of crossfire that's having really immediate effects. And to Ben's point, is going to have long-term effects in different ways that are also they're going to intersect, right, with this issue of graduate student funding. So I've spoken with more than one faculty member recruited via race or inequality kind of focused cluster programs, right? Thinking about the focus of research, who've had grants revoked or grants that were about to be delivered pulled back. Including things like R01s from the National Institutes of Health, right, which are typically considered the required capital to get tenure. And these grants are often the resources used to fund the next generation of graduate students, right? So attacking this research funding is just a brilliant way to sort of rewrite the professoriate, right? The academy and the knowledge production economy. And so this is something I'm really hoping I know institutions can't backfill all the research funding, but institutions are in control of things like their tenure and promotion guidelines, right? And thinking as creatively as possible about how to maintain the graduate school pipeline, because we've seen schools say, okay, we're not going to recruit or admit more graduate students, but we have to think about kind of what that means for our knowledge economy, for our world, right? More long term than just tomorrow. So I think just reminding ourselves that the way that current policies are targeting programs and classes and research funding focused on race, gender, disability, environmental justice is really intended and really intentional around changing the futures of our students of color, Black, disabled, Indigenous, trans folks, women on our campuses. And this is about people's livelihoods right now. And that's something I've been seeing.
I think
Just
that's such just, go ahead, Laura. Go ahead.
just a final note. I think you're saying what I'm going to say in other words. But the science philanthropy community of which we are a part is deeply concerned about a lost generation of scientists. And we've talked about attacks on DEI, on education funding, on financial aid, on there's widespread attack on science, on the scientific enterprise. Again, this isn't new. This has been going on. This is, of course, a heightened level of what has been going on, much as these other things are, perhaps a more targeted and intentional level. But we're very concerned about that, and specifically around trainees. Most of the research grants that we make have trainees on them. We're actually quite proud as a foundation in how much we invest in early career scholars. And then in the higher education program that I lead, we have several scholarship programs for graduate students, master's and doctoral students at select campuses. And so we're very invested in trainees and are very concerned about the future of that population and just the numbers that we will see coming into these various labs that we support, given just a contracting of graduate programs and funding. And there's much dust to settle, but that really is the, just an overarching concern of this entire community.
If I can just sort of add
Go
on
ahead.
to this, we've been talking about funding and then about disparate impacts or magnified impacts on marginalized populations on our campuses. And I want to just make sure to draw attention to the way in which federal policy is targeting international students and researchers, right? We've seen the visas being canceled. We've seen people being picked up on streets. We've seen laws being passed in state capitals that limit the speech rights of people who are not citizens, right? We have Marco Rubio talking about using people's social media posts as fodder for refusing visas, right? Subjecting people to aggressive review, I believe he said. This is a problem for the financials of universities, because so many foreign students who come do pay tuition, and that helps to frankly subsidize budgets for universities as a whole. But it's also debilitating for the research pipeline in a lot of different fields. And personally, I just want to say a colleague of mine who is a Chinese national was fired from a university in Florida, specifically and only because he is Chinese. And they decided that the Florida's Country of Concern bill meant that the university could no longer employ someone as a Chinese language instructor because they are Chinese. And the xenophobia is something that we need to name and we need to reckon with. It's going to have long-term repercussions for our higher education and also just for the well-being of our society when people are unable to speak and unable to understand other cultures. We are impoverished.
I think our president wanted to say something. I saw your hand up.
No, that was a wrong tap. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. No, I really think, and in the midst of all of these things, there's so much more that institutions in this moment could be doing, right? And I know it's challenging because of the accreditation pieces, because of the federal funding, because of the polarization and the political attacks that are being that's happening across the nation at this point, right? But I still believe we can do more to support and uplift our faculty, staff, and students in these moments. And so as we kind of segue into the end of this conversation, we're wondering, what strategies would you recommend? Have you all seen that can be adopted to kind of mitigate some of these funding constraints.
I come at this from the non-institutional lens. You know, I no longer work on a campus. I was in student affairs for 10 years before I moved over to doing this work. Obviously, some institutions that have endowment resources are dipping into them. That's also not the reality for the vast number of institutions around the country. And I think the real piece that we have to remember that's all interconnected here is when there's gaps, particularly at a state institution, I think we are going to be looking to states to help fill that gap. Now, that's going to be a larger challenge because in the grand political picture right now, if there are cuts to public benefits like Medicaid to the level that we're seeing, if there's cuts to kind of the supplemental nutrition assistance program, all of these types of things, those are also going to be on the hook for states to cover those gaps. And so, you know, again, I go back to what I said a few minutes ago, like this is the definition of higher ed being returned to the states, and that does not come for free. There is an associated cost with that. And I think pivoting the message a little bit from the institutional lens more to what can states do to help kind of meet these gaps, because I also would be willing to bet that like right now politically it would be really difficult for a lot of institutions to raise tuition prices to cover those gaps. I think that would just be a really tough thing to happen. And so I think that's where, if I were on a campus right now, that's where I would be wanting to put that pressure, is on state lawmakers and specifically those that are making appropriations decisions in the state house.
I think I need to say that private philanthropy cannot fill the gap of the federal government. Just to be responsible, a responsible grant maker, I need to say that. But of course, there's more that we can do together than we can do alone. And so we're doing a lot of co-funding, pooled funding, really just strategic funding alongside others that have the same goals and values. So there's a lot of that happening behind the scenes that, you know, you would never see. So that's positive. I do think too, there's always opportunity in crisis. I know that is like a very cliche term. I need to find a better way of saying it. But there's, you know, someone said earlier, there's opportunity to examine the structures that we've put into place, the systems that we operate under, the norms that we have in higher education. And if there's ever an opportunity to revisit those, I think that time is now. I know we're a bit in reactionary mode, and that is totally sensible for where we are. But we do need to move next to how we rethink some of these systems in light of scarcity. And that's actually a forcing function in a lot of different scenarios. So I think just we need to keep that front of mind. And you know, one of the things that I hear a lot of leaders talking about and faculty members is just rethinking the promotion and tenure process, rethinking what is truly valued. And of course, when you think about just a lot of the mistrust for higher education right now on the part of some of our, you know, some of our citizens, on the part of a plurality of our citizenship, you know, you want to think like, why is that the case? Have they had a negative experience of higher education? Are we not connecting with communities in ways that we should be? Of course, we have to reward that in that process, right? In that tenure and promotion process. So that's just one example that I hear people talking a lot about, and that, you know, certainly I'm thinking about.
And I think building on two of the points I heard you make, Lorelle, around kind of organizing, right? So working together, organizing, and also around messaging. So I think we're seeing a somewhat more coherent, cohesive approach to organizing in response to the NIH and NSF overhead rollbacks, right? More litigation, more direct challenging around the ideas of, you know, how science drives our economy, how science drives our health outcomes, things along those lines. And I think thinking about the other opportunities, right, to organize resistance at the organizational level, to do things like apply, greater pressure, positive pressure in the states, but also, organize resistance, strengthen numbers to, resist unconstitutional demands, right, on campuses. So I think trying to think more like organizers would be a really savvy move, at the campus level. Not the strength that we have, but we can build on that. And as we do that, I think there is the messaging piece, right? Because I think that this idea of the mistrust and the anti-DEI lie that we're being told, right, it's really catchy messaging. The idea that some nefarious like set of individuals in higher ed are benefiting from, affirmative action like policies to the detriment of regular people, right? That's a really effective threat-based argument. And so the gains that we've made in our policies and our thinking and our teaching to pursue more equitable futures are really being framed as this enemy, right, of merit, enemy of excellence, enemy of regular people. And we know this is a racist dog whistle, and it's not reflecting data, right? And it's making a lot of white folks fear that education is this zero-sum game. And I think we need to better counter that, in terms of our messaging, right? If anti-DEI is, pro, what have I said, homogeneity, exclusivity, and inequality. And if that's the case, like, how do we tell our story that DEI, for all its faults, and I don't like the acronym, but the vision behind DEI is about civil rights. The vision is about a more equitable society, and it is about mobility. Um, and I think right now we don't have a coherent narrative that we are willing to rally behind, but I think we can. I think we could. And it also is about breaking down this idea of the zero-sum game, and breaking down the idea of that there is some group of people who want to keep the average Joe down in higher ed, and it's quite the opposite. So I think rethinking our messaging is important and powerful.
I want to thank Heather for the way that you framed that. I think it's really important that we keep an eye on the values that are behind diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we do have to do a better job of making our case for higher education, for research, for things like tenure, for why we need to have programs that open the gates to who gets to come into higher education. But I think individually, in this moment, we need to lean into what our work is about and not hide how the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion inform what we do. Find other ways of talking about it, perhaps, but pulling back and being reticent or conceding the terrain is not going to stop people from attacking higher education. It's just going to embolden them further. Lorelle's comment at the beginning was that that funders, philanthropics cannot fill the breach. And I think that is quite true. We're talking about billions of dollars of impact across the country. But I do also want to recognize the way in which different foundations, including Sloan, have been supporting people to keep on message, right? We're in this because it matters. Opening doors and bringing more people into higher education, the value of equity, those things matter. Encouraging people to speak freely and to ask questions, those things matter for individuals and for the health of our society. So I do want to thank philanthropics for doing what they can and recognize that nobody can quite fill the breach. We just have to hope we can weather the storm.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop. Please help us thank our amazing panelists for their time, for sharing their expertise. We just greatly appreciate all the ways that you all have contributed to this conversation and continue to do the work within your organizations and associations. So at this time, we are going to stop the recording because we are going to transition into breakout room discussions. Some of our panelist members are able to stay and join in those conversations. A couple have to run. So